started with a card. A simple pink card placed in my hands on a quiet Sunday morning. Mother's Day. The kind of day that is supposed to feel warm, safe, full of gratitude. But what happened next changed everything. My name is Grace. I am 74 years old, and that was the day I realized I was no longer a mother in my daughter's eyes. That morning, I stood outside Danielle's house holding flowers and a small box of sweets, wearing my favorite green dress, trying to feel elegant, trying to feel wanted. When the door opened, my youngest grandchild ran into my arms, calling out, "Grandma Grace." And for a brief moment, everything felt right again. But that moment faded quickly. Danielle greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Michael barely acknowledged me. Something felt off, something subtle but heavy, like a silence waiting to speak. We sat in the living room. The children gathered around, and Danielle handed me a card decorated with drawings. "Read it out loud," she said, almost casually. I opened it, smiling at first, touched by the effort, and began to read. "Roses are red, violets are blue." My voice was steady until I reached the next line. "You're a heavy burden. No one wants you here." I froze. I read it again, silently this time, hoping I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. The words were real. The room went quiet for a moment, and then the laughter started. Loud, careless laughter. Michael laughed first, then Danielle, and soon even the children joined in, not understanding, just following the tone. I continued reading in a broken voice. "Your time has passed. It's time for you to go." My hands trembled as the card slipped to the floor. Tears came quietly, but no one stopped laughing. "It's just a joke," Danielle said, telling me not to be dramatic. But jokes often carry truth. And in that moment, I understood something had been broken long before that day. That night, alone in my house, I sat in the same chair where I had once held Danielle as a child, comforting her after her father abandoned us. I remembered everything. The years I worked double shifts, the sacrifices I made, the jewelry I sold to pay for her education, the money I gave for her wedding, her house, her children. I had given without counting, without questioning, believing love was enough. But slowly, gratitude had turned into expectation, and expectation into entitlement. I became useful, not valued, present but not respected. And as I sat there holding that card, I began to see the pattern clearly. This wasn't a single moment of cruelty. It was the result of years of being taken for granted. Then something shifted inside me. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became clarity. I opened a box of documents I had kept hidden for years, bank statements, property papers, investments. My family believed I was dependent, living modestly because I had no choice. They didn't know I had savings, assets, even a property far away that had been quietly generating income. I had lived simply not out of need but by choice. And in that moment I realized something important. I was not the burden. I was the one who had been carrying them. The support I gave, the money I sent, the stability I provided, they had built their lives on it without ever acknowledging its source. By morning, my decisions were made. Calm, deliberate, final. I stopped the monthly financial support. I closed the shared accounts. I reorganized my finances and changed my will. Everything I had planned to leave behind would no longer go to people who saw me as a burden. I also made a plan for myself. There was a place waiting for me, a life I had postponed for too long. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine living without obligation, without constant disappointment. When I looked around my house that morning, I didn't feel sadness. I felt understanding. By morning, my decisions were made. Not in anger, not in haste, but with a calm certainty I hadn't felt in years. The kind of clarity that comes only after something inside you finally breaks, and then rebuilds itself differently. I sat at my table as the first light of day entered the room, soft and quiet, almost respectful of the moment. My hands no longer trembled. My thoughts were no longer scattered. Everything felt aligned. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't reacting to life. I was choosing it. One decision at a time, I began to take back control. I stopped the monthly financial support I had been sending without question. I closed the shared accounts that had slowly become one-sided. I reviewed every document, every number, every commitment I had made out of love that had been mistaken for obligation. Then I changed my will. Not as an act of punishment, but as an act of truth. Because what we leave behind should reflect what we were valued for, not what we were used for. Everything I had once planned to give them was no longer meant for people who saw me as a burden instead of a blessing. But that wasn't the most important change. The most important change was internal. For years, I had built my life around others, around their needs, their comfort, their expectations. I had adjusted myself to fit into spaces where I was slowly disappearing. And somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking a simple question: what about me? That morning, I finally allowed myself to ask it, and more importantly, to answer it honestly. I made a plan for myself. A real plan. Not something postponed or sacrificed for later. There was a place waiting for me. A life I had quietly set aside, thinking there would always be time. A place where I could wake up without feeling like an obligation. Where my presence wouldn't be tolerated but welcomed, even if only by the peace around me. I allowed myself to imagine a life without constant disappointment. A life where I didn't have to earn my place in someone else's world. When I looked around my house that morning, I expected to feel sadness. After all, this was where so many memories lived. Where laughter had once echoed, where I had raised my daughter, where I had spent years giving everything I had. But what I felt instead was something quieter, something deeper. Understanding. Because this wasn't an ending. It wasn't loss. It was correction. A long overdue adjustment to a truth I had avoided for too long. Sometimes the hardest part isn't accepting that people change. It's accepting that we see the change and choose to ignore it. We excuse it. We soften it. We tell ourselves stories to protect what we don't want to lose. Until one day, the truth becomes too loud to silence. That card was never just a joke. It was a reflection. A moment where everything unspoken finally showed itself, clearly and without disguise. And once you see something like that, truly see it, there is no going back to who you were before. You can only move forward. You can only decide what comes next. And that decision is yours alone. I chose to leave, not because I hated them, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood that staying would mean continuing to accept a version of myself that I no longer recognized. I didn't want to spend whatever time I had left trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided it didn't exist. There comes a moment in life when you realize that love should not feel like negotiation, that respect should not feel conditional, that your presence should not feel like a burden you have to justify. And when that moment comes, you either ignore it again or you act. That day I acted. I chose dignity over familiarity, peace over proximity, truth over illusion. And as I stepped into that choice, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel alone. I felt free. Free. Free from the silent expectations, the unspoken disappointments, the slow erosion of self that I had accepted for far too long. For the first time in 74 years, I wasn't living for someone else's version of me. I wasn't shrinking to fit into their comfort. I wasn't waiting to be appreciated. I simply was. And that was enough.